going to talk deadlifts. We're going to talk neck position, specifically position of the head within the deadlift. So, this conversation originates back to one of my older videos in which I got into a disagreement with someone regarding the position of the head during the pull, specifically when they're at setup. Now, there are two sides to this argument. Neither one is right and neither one is wrong. So let me just preface this conversation just with that point for discussion. Now, the one thing that we have to consider when we're coaching or when you're using a different head position is the influence of the cervical spine on the thoracic and the lumbar spine. What I mean is that the spine is like a rope. I've mentioned this analogy in older videos. What you're going to see is that when specific segments of the spine, whether it be thoracic, lumbar, or cervical, are altered, you're going to then get subsequent alterations up and down the spine. In the case of the neck in the pull, what are you going to see typically with Olympic lifters? Well, for one, you're never going to see an Olympic lifter set up and be looking down at the floor. Every single Olympic lifter is looking up, and then typically as they're going to extend, some of them will even look up at the ceiling. Why? Well, what they're doing is as the head, specifically the chin, is raised and the cervical spine goes into extension, you will find that that is coupled typically by a little bit more extension bias through the lumbar spine. Really, you're just increasing tone through the spinal erectors, and that's what you're seeing. So, if you watch that Olympic setup in a lot of lifters, their last move is they're kind of here, they're getting set, and then once they get their breath, they kind of pull themselves into this extended position with the head up to then extend in the pull. Not wrong. We need to learn that we can be in extension and quote unquote live in extension during our session, but then we need to be able to get out of that extension into more of a flexion bias and more of a parasympathetic environment post-workout. So getting back to our neck discussion here, what you have to remember is that cueing with every single movement, whether it be the squat, the deadlift, the bench, it all has to be individualized. So what you have to consider in your mind, whether you're coaching someone else or whether you're coaching yourself, is how do I present, how does my athlete present? Are they typically a more extended individual? So they kind of walk around like this with this big chest, anteriorly tilted hips. Do they find that when they take off their running shoes, do they find that their center of gravity shifts backwards? So for example, are they always living out forward in the sagittal plane? Is their center of gravity shifted forward? If it is, then they're probably somewhat more extended. If you're more flexion biased, so let's say you work a desk job and you kind of live in an overly kyphotic position, well, that's going to obviously bias more flexion. In that case, those folks may respond better to a slightly extended cervical spine within the deadlift. Well, why? It may bias more extension globally through the spine. The caveat here is if the person is rounded via the thoracic spine, what you may find is that in that case, you may have to have them look at the floor but learn to pack the neck. So imagine you're trying to actually retract the head. This retraction effect will typically bring about thoracic extension. So you have to consider the individual, and then you have to consider the cue. The looking forward, as a lot of people do, will bias more extension. Looking down and packing the neck will bias more extension within the thoracic spine, but not as much extension within the lumbar spine. It all depends on the individual, and that's going to depend on what their asymmetries are, what their limb lengths are, what style of deadlift are you using, or what style of squat are you using relative to the individual. So one cue is not right and one cue is not wrong. Eric Cressy's big on the neck packed position, talking about there's probably a lower incidence of cervical spine herniation. Layton Norton's dealing with some big herniations within his neck now. Could be due to deadlifts, it could be due to nothing at all. There's a lot of people that lift with their head up. But that's just an example of something that might be correlated between the deadlift and what Cressy's referring to. So it's something to consider. Keep in your mind, how is this cue going to affect the person, and what is the person's current biases, and how can I cue them out of them? So just something to get you guys thinking.